Rebellion and Reaction, the 1960s and the 1970s. At the end of this unit of study, the U.S. history student should be able to answer these focused questions. How did the origins of the youth revolt shape the New Left and the counterculture? 2. How did the youth revolt and early civil rights movement influence other protest movements? How did new protest movements affect social attitudes and public safety? 3. How did the political environment of the late 60s influence Richard Nixon's election strategy and domestic policy? 4. How and why did Nixon change military and political strategies to end America's involvement in the Vietnam War? 5. What was the international strategy brought by Nixon and Kissinger's diplomacy and foreign policy during the 1970s? And 6. How did Watergate scandal unfold, and what was its political significance? Forever young, the youth revolt, the new left. The youth of the 1950s were not the young adults of the 1960s. They had not experienced major depressions or wars as their forebears had. They fell into the spheres of the civil rights movements, which led them to apply the demands by African Americans to other groups, such as women, Native Americans, homosexuals, and Hispanics. The Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, formed a politically active group of young protesters. Led by Tom Hayden and Alan Habert, the group issued the Port Huron Statement, which outlined their frustrations with the old left and promoted the new left's involvement in social and political activism to create change that called for mass grassroots action and participatory democracy. The free speech movement was a student movement at the University of California, Berkeley, formed in 1964 to protest limitations on political activities on campus. The Model Cities Program. The goal: the federal government launched the Model Cities Program in 1966 to mobilize residents of poor neighborhoods to improve housing, education, health services, and job opportunities. It was part of the Great Society. The Model Cities program encouraged community involvement in urban planning, effort to target federal funds to upgrade public services and economic opportunity, and specifically define urban neighborhoods between 1966 and 1974. Detroit was in the Model Cities program and was a disaster, but it did accomplish some real good. The creation of state-supported Democratic political power base. The program also resulted in much higher taxes, which were easy to pitch to poor voters who didn't have to pay them. Major Kavanaugh pushed a new income tax through state legislatures and a commuter tax on city workers. This created a white flight. In Detroit, they did not like paying new taxes, larger taxes to fund the program of poor neighborhoods that voted Democrat. And so in 1966, more than 22,000 middle and upper class residents moved out of the city. In July of 1967, the police attempted to break up a late-night party in the middle of a new model city. The scene turned into the worst race riot of the 1960s. The violence killed more than 40 people and left more than 5,000 people homeless. One of the first stores to be looted was a black-owned pharmacy. The largest black-owned clothing store in the city was also burned to the ground. Mayor Kavanaugh did nothing to stop the riots, fearing a large police presence would make matters worse. 5 days later, President Johnson sent in 2 divisions of paratroopers to put down the insurrection. Over the next 18 months, an additional 140,000 upper and middle class residents, almost all of them white, had left the city. Detroit has yet to recover. Anti-war protests. Selective Service System, the federal agency that coordinated military conscription before and during the Vietnam War. In 1966 and 1967, anti-war activity changed from respectful protests to direct confrontation. This is because many young men had objected to being drafted to serve in the war that they viewed as outside their daily concerns. A war they saw caused by U.S. aggressions or the growth of the military-industrial complex. College students were often able to avoid serving the war due to exemptions. The exemptions disproportionately favored white, middle-class, and upper-class young men. College and medical deferments focused the draft on small town and working class youth. Military service widened the gap between white and blacks as African Americans served way beyond the percentage of the population. African American and Latino men served at higher levels, often because they could not avoid the draft. Ignoring the draft, the new university trained middle class young adults found the escalating war in Vietnam of grave concern. When 1966, the draft was modified to make them eligible. That means that their little white butt could now get shot. This led to the birth of the New Left and the anti war movement. College students often avoid serving the Vietnam War, and many draftees ignored draft notices, applied for conscientious objector status, or just fled the country to Canada. Yet two-thirds of the men who served in the Vietnam were volunteers. Two-thirds of the men who served in World War II were drafted. Approximately 70% of those killed in Vietnam were volunteers. Rising violence. Protests against economic and social inequality and racial injustice in the country, combined with frustrations over the draft system in 67 through 68, had exploded into a more violent anti-war protest in inner-city neighborhoods of many large urban areas in the United States. At Columbia University, led by Mark Rudd, leader of the SDS at Columbia, and black militants took over Columbia University. Violence erupted between the student protesters and the New York City police, leading to over 700 arrests and 100 injured students. The failure among SDS and other radical New Left leaders in this and other protests at universities around the nation to move from criticism of the status quo to outlining a vision for a future undermined their support. These protesters took place within large global context of 68 as a result of protests and attempted revolutions in a variety of nations. They were also exacerbated by the assassinations of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and presidential hopeful Bobby Kennedy. Perhaps the best evidence of how the New Left felt is the 1968 Democratic Convention. When riots broke out, police were sent in to end the riots, and it was all televised. A group known as the Weather Underground, originally the Revolutionary Youth Movement, the RYM, emerged and embraced revolutionary violence and the idea of worldwide communism. The group viewed themselves as white militant counterparts to the Black Panthers. They assaulted police and trashed areas in cities such as Chicago and bombed draft offices, federal facilities, corporate headquarters, and other areas that they associated with the military industrial complex, capitalism, and the status quo. Their violence ultimately undermined the group within the New Left and much of America and resulted in a crackdown by the FBI. The counterculture. Do Your Own Thing author Ken Kesey and his posse, the Merry Pranksters, held the acid test graduation parties throughout the San Francisco area that celebrated the psychedelic drug LSD, known as acid. The events of the 1960s led many away from the radical politics of the youth and toward a counterculture, that of the hippies. Direct descendants of the Beats, they wore long hair, blue jeans, took drugs, and were not interested in organized political action. White, middle class individuals made up most of the counterculture. They emphasized their frustration with mainstream society and their decision to choose an alternative lifestyle that embraced the idea of freedom in many forms. For many of them, this included the use of psychedelic substances such as LSD, marijuana, amphetamines, cocaine, peyote, and other illegal substances. 8 Miles High Dr. Timothy Leary hoped illegal drugs such as marijuana, amphetamines, cocaine, peyote, hashish, heroin, and LSD become commonplace, with the counterculture getting stoned was the favorite thing to do in the 1967 Summer Love. The most publicized activity of the Summer Love crowd in San Francisco, where more than 100,000 hippies believed in the age of Aquarius. The Beatles provided the Summer Love with its anthem, All You Need Is Love. The Yippies began in New York City in 1967 under the leadership of Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. They embraced the use of psychedelic substances and offered people an alternative counterculture lifestyle that they depicted as full of fun, revolution, and freedom. They wanted to form an alliance between hippies and the Weathermen, a blending of pot and politics. Rubin claimed that the first part of the program is to kill your parents, since they are our first oppressors, to screw work, and just to know themselves. Their platform called for a peace of Vietnam, absolute freedom, free birth control and abortions, and legalization of marijuana and LSD. Communes. Some counterculture members formed communes, intentional communities that include a variety of alternative living arrangements that included both urban and rural communes. Although they began optimistically, most of the communes failed within a few months or years. Almost none of the participants knew how to sustain a farm, and many were willing to do the hard work that were living off the land required. Religious cults also grew during this period. The Manson Family, a quasi commune that arose in California in the late 1960s. Helter Skelter. Manson believed in what he called Helter Skelter, a term he took from one of the songs by the name of the Beatles. Manson believed Helter Skelter to be an impending apocalyptic race war, which he described in his own version of the lyrics in the Beatles song. He believed his murderers would help participate in that war. From the beginning of his notoriety, a pop culture rose around him, in which he ultimately became an emblem of insanity, violence, and macabre. The term was later used by Manson prosecutor Vincent Biglisi as the title of the book he wrote about the Manson murders. He was found guilty of conspiring to commit the Tate LaBianca murders carried out by members of the group at his instructions. He was convicted of the murders through the joint responsibility rule, which makes each member of a conspiracy guilty of crimes his fellow conspirators commit in furtherance of the conspiracy object. Manson would serve life imprisonment and die in prison. The sounds of change. The counterculture was shaped mostly by music. The abrupt shift from the complacent rock and roll of the early 1960s to the provocative rock of the mild decade reflected the sharp changes in American society. Music became a vehicle of protest and experimentation. Social criticism and class consciousness were major themes of music in the late 1960s. Highway 61 Revisited, commenting on Dylan's imagery, Scaduto wrote, not did since Rimbaud has a poet used all the language of the street to expose the horrors of the street, describe a state of the union that is ugly and absurd. Rebel Soul. The Beatles broadened their sound, most notably with the influences drawn from the contemporary folk rock of Bob Dylan and the Byrds. The album also saw the Beatles broadening rock and roll's instrumental resources. Surrealistic Pillow was the first blockbuster psychedelic album by a band from San Francisco called Jefferson Airplane, announcing to the world the active bohemian scene that had developed there, starting with the Beats during the 1960s and extending the change throughout the 1960s into high Ashbury counterculture. White Rabbit became one of the first songs to sneak drug references past censors on the radio. The counterculture had its consumer aspects, as was shown by fashion, music, and the Woodstock Festival. The growth of the Woodstock generation in the 1960s revealed the feeling of alienation that existed within American society. The apex of the counterculture era was the 3 day long Woodstock Festival in August 1969, which a half a million people attended, converged on a 600-acre farm owned by conservative Republican Max Yasgur, who supported the Vietnam War. Yasgur also believed strongly in freedom of expression and was angered by the hostility of some townspeople toward the anti war hippies. Hosting the festival became for him a cause. The event included a wide variety of big name musicians and artists, like Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, Santana, The Who, Joan Baez, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and other groups were invited but declined and thought it was just going to be a small, insignificant festival. The participants danced, sang, and enjoyed the music in addition to drinking alcohol, taking drugs, and also having casual sex. 4 months later, however, violence broke out at the Altamont Speedway Free Festival when a young African American man with a gun was stabbed by drunken Hells Angels. 3 other spectators were also killed. The violence besmirched the optimism and carefree spirit of the counterculture. Social activism. The revival of the women's rights movement was helped by Presidential Commission on the Status of Women in 1961. The inclusion of gender as one of the categories protected in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Mainstream feminism focused on unequal job opportunities. More reliable methods of contraception gave women more control over childbearing. The mainstream of women's movement was led by Betty Friedan in the lower right, whose book The Feminine Mystique elevated the movement to national levels. Women's liberation took off as a social and political movement in the 1970s and 1971. Gloria Steinem, in the upper right, became the national face of the spokesman of New Feminism. Ms. Magazine gave the women's movement a national voice in 1972. But there was inner turmoil. Frieden and Steinem began fighting for control of the women's movement. Other women noted that the movement was too focused on white middle class concerns. Feminist Victories. Congressional action in 1972 applied affirmative action to colleges, requiring equal opportunities for women in academics and also in sports. Title IX of the Educational Amendments of 1972 barred gender discrimination in education programs and activities that received federal financial support. The Equals Right Amendment, ERA, if ratified, would have required equal treatment for women. In 1973, the Supreme Court ruled in Roe v. Wade and struck down state laws prohibiting first-term abortions. Fractured feminism. Top. The anti-feminist campaign Stop ERA, Stop Taking Our Privilege Equal Rights Amendment, found in its most outspoken activist in Phyllis Schlafly, a constitutional lawyer and staunch conservative. On the bottom, we see the Women's Strike for Equality brought tens of thousands of women together on August 26, 1970, to march for gender equality and celebrate the 50th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. A group of younger feminists in the late 1960s argued for women's liberation and took a more radical approach to asserting the need for equality. Many of these women had expressed from their work in the civil rights and anti-war movements and had grown tired of trying to gain equality through social persuasion and legal action. Some women, especially lesbians and bisexuals, wanted their needs to be put a part of the feminist movement's public platform as well. Radical and moderate feminists divided sharply on a variety of topics or approaches to achieve equality and what that meant. Conservative women were repelled by the more radical elements of feminism, and the growth of conservatism in the late 1970s and early 80s undermined the movement. The ERA process ended in 1982 when it failed ratification. The women's movement has long-term impacts despite these failures, and many of its themes continue to shape discussions concerning equality and women's rights today. The sexual revolution. In an effort to spread the word about birth control options, Planned Parenthood in 1967 displayed posters like this one in the New York City buses. Feminists called attention to the issues long hidden away or ignored. The sexual revolution and feminist movement promoted the tolerance of premarital sex, family planning, and the open sexual activity of women. The efforts of feminists also helped bring about the improvement in divorce laws. The FDA approved use of birth control pills in 1960, and the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973 made abortions more available. As many men and women began to participate more freely in casual sex, the risk of sexual transmitted diseases also rose. However, many women viewed the pill as a way to gain better control of their bodies, futures, and career paths. Latino Rights. Cesar Chavez, who's in the center, were the organizers of the Great Boycott. In 1968, Chavez ended a 3-week fast by taking communion and breaking bread with Senator Robert F. Kennedy. The term Hispanic and Latino came into vogue after 1945 to describe the Spanish speaking citizens of the United States. After World War II, Latino leaders worked along the same lines as African American civil rights leaders to secure the same rights for their people as the Anglo citizens had. The United Farm Workers, the UFW, formed as a civil rights organization for Latino American workers in 1965. Cesar Chavez, the son of Mexican immigrants, founded the group in an effort to help organize Latino farm workers in a call for rights, especially for migrant farm workers. The group's strike against California grape growers in 1965 brought the UFW national attention. Chavez's 25-day hunger strike in '68 called further attention to the needs of migrant farm workers and gained the public support of Robert F. Kennedy. The grape growers agreed to many of the UFW's demands in 1970, and Chavez and the UFW continued to push for Latino rights and political participation in other areas across the nation. Native American rights. Instigating a standoff with the FBI, members of AIM and local Oglala Sioux occupied the town of Wounded Knee, South Dakota in March of 1973 in an effort to focus attention on poverty and rampant alcoholism among Indians on the reservation. During the late 60s, the American Indians adopted the sobriquet Native Americans and began working to retain their native identities within their ever dwindling numbers. Red Power protests argued for more to be done faster to fund anti poverty programs on reservations and promote equality for Native Americans. The American Indian Movement, AIM, group of Native American political activists who used confrontations with the federal government to publicize their case for Indian rights. In 1973, a group of Sioux at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, protesting the light sentences a group of whites received after killing a Native American took hostages. The standoff ended when governments agreed to redress Indian treaty rights, but not before blood was shed. Armed confrontation between militant Indians and state and federal law officers at Wounded Knee, South Dakota in '73 recalled the decades of warfare between the Plains Indians and the U.S. Army in the previous century. If one might remember, Wounded Knee was the last time there was combat between the cavalry and an Indian nation. The Trail of Broken Tears March on Washington. Native Americans win both legislative and legal battles. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act gave greater control over the education of Native Americans to Native American tribes and able to reclaim their land taken to them from various treaties. Before a Senate committee, Russell Means in 1989 said, "If you want to see an example of failed socialism, go to an Indian reservation. This is the everyday occurrence in all tribal governments." Needless to say, every time the U.S. government has interfered with American Indian lifestyles, it has proved to be disastrous. With their efforts coupled with Anglo guilt for centuries of abuse, Native Americans were able to promote their cause to better their conditions. Gay and lesbian rights. Activists marched in the annual Gay Parade Day demonstration commemorating the 5th anniversary of the Stonewall riots that sparked what became the modern LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer rights movement in the United States. Spurred by the liberation other groups were experiencing during this time, homosexuals also worked to secure similar benefits. When the Stonewall riots erupted after a police raid at a popular New York homosexual club, the violence in which the police put it down elicited national attention. The American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders in 1973. By the end of the 1970s, the majority of the momentum in this movement was gone. Nixon and the revival of conservatism. Because of violent protests by whites against forced desegregation, school buses in South Boston are escorted by police in October of 1974. Many Americans rejected or distrusted the social and cultural reforms promoted by the New Left or by civil rights organizations in the 1960s. Nixon called these primary working and middle class white families the nation's silent majority and considered himself their spokesperson. Nixon was a complex man who grew up in a struggling working class family. He was intelligent, determined, and manipulative, earning the nickname Tricky Dick from his critics. He was undermined by the violent mood swings made worse by alcohol abuse and insecurity. He was a political savvy opportunist who crafted himself as liberal or conservative of the various issues based on the way these would help or hurt his political future and ambitions. Nixon appointed only white men that were loyal to him for his cabinet staff in his first term. John Mitchell was his attorney general, H.R. Haldeman his chief of staff, John Ehrlichman his chief domestic policy advisor, John Dean III, White House legal counsel. He especially depended on the advice of Dr. Henry Kissinger for foreign policy and national security advice. The Southern Strategy. In an effort to bolster the economies of the states and recruit conservative Democratic support, Nixon followed through with his new federalism program that secured legislation allowing $30 billion in federal funds for states to be used as those states saw fit. Nixon's domestic policy was geared to solidify his support of Middle America. Nixon ignored troubled big cities and tilted spending towards the suburbs by funneling more money to suburbs through no strings grants. This is because the cities were becoming predominantly Democrat and they weren't electing Republicans. Nixon's new federalism policy was centered on the general revenue sharing that passed federal funds directly to local governments with no limits on use to shift responsibilities for government programs from the federal level to the states. Nixon also sought to undermine or end many of the Johnson Great Society programs, but also signed legislation passed by the Democratic controlled Congress that passed a series of significant legislation during his presidency. The 26th Amendment that was ratified in 1971 lowered the voting age to 18, responding to criticism that many people who are old enough to be drafted should be able to vote. The Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, of 1970 sought to make workplaces safer for employees. Nixon had won the presidency in 1968 by promising the South that he would slow federal demands for implementing civil rights. He tried to prevent desegregation but was overruled by the Supreme Court. Nixon and environmental protection. The OPEC boycott led many to realize the possibility of running out of natural resources. In addition, several disasters that caught national attention occurred. In 1969, including an oil spill in Santa Barbara, California, coast and an oil and grease-based fire that engulfed the Cuyahoga River near Cleveland, Ohio. The environmental movement was born. Nixon supported legislation promoting such conservation passed by the democratically controlled Congress. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, by executive orders in 1970. Nixon did not embrace the environmental movement entirely. Rather, he seemed to view it as an issue on which he knew the Democratic majorities in Congress would override him. He signed the Clean Air Act at times. He vetoed some of the laws passed by Congress, but vetoed a new Clean Water Act, or refused to spend the money that was appropriated to fund them. Stagflation and the oil crisis. The scarcity of oil was dealt with by the rationing of gasoline. Gas stations, such as this one in Colorado, closed on Sundays to conserve supplies. Economic stagnation. Nixon's administration saw the beginning of a rise in inflation that would last to Reagan's time. By 1970, inflation had reached 6%. The nation was experiencing a period of economic recession. At the same time, inflation ran rampant, coupled with rising inflation and high unemployment. This is known as stagflation. When the United States supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War against Egypt and Syria, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC, raised oil prices 400% for those supporting Israel. This had a devastating effect on the American economy. Gas lines stretched for miles, and millions would lose their jobs. Other causes of stagflation included the long-term impact of the rising cost of Johnson's administration's Great Society programs, as well as the Vietnam War. The economic competition now coming from West Germany, Japan, and other industrial powers in the world also came into play. Peace with honor, ending the Vietnam War. When Nixon was inaugurated, the United States had over 530,000 soldiers in Vietnam. He believed that victory was unattainable and planned to gradually withdraw American troops as a sufficient number of South Vietnamese were trained to replace them. This was called Vietnamization. Nixon and Kissinger sought a gradual withdrawal of the troops, and negotiations between the United States and South Vietnam on the one hand, as well as North Vietnamese and VC Cong negotiators, publicly faltered over a variety of issues, including a communist influence and presence in South Vietnam. Privately, however, Kissinger and North Vietnamese leaders held talks without informing South Vietnamese leaders. Nixon and Kissinger also sought to equip and train South Vietnamese military members so that American troops can gradually withdraw from combat in the nation in a process called Vietnamization. Meanwhile, they would send more bombing missions to North Vietnam to take the pressure off South Vietnam. From 1969 to 1973, a lottery system for the American draft addressed a number of inequities of the former system. In 1973, Nixon did away with the draft, and the Army became purely voluntary. The slow withdrawal of troops had a horrific effect on the military's morale. No one wanted to be the last to leave or to possibly die in Vietnam. The events of the My Lai massacre further eroded American support of the war back home. The shooting at Kent State. Marianne Vecchio, a teenage runaway participating in the anti-war demonstration, decries the killing of a Kent State student after the National Guard fired into the crowd. When the nation learned that the war had been extended to Cambodia, further protests began. College campuses and universities were shut down. One was held at Kent State University, and it erupted into violence when the Ohio National Guard members had been sent to the university, fired in response to insults and rocks being hurled at them. Another students were killed or wounded. The Pentagon Papers. In June 1971, Daniel Ellsberg and the Defense Department leaked the Pentagon Papers, which were published by the New York Times. This secret study, conducted by Robert McNamara, LBJ's former Secretary of Defense, provided a classified history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam and concluded that the kind of war the U.S. was fighting in Vietnam could not be won. Especially damaging was the Gulf of Tonkin basically didn't really happen, and that's what had escalated us into the Vietnam War. Its publication in the New York Times and others began on July 1st, but administrative attempts to get the injunction against the publication was blocked by the Supreme Court. Although Ellsberg was indicted for theft of government property, violating the Espionage Act by leaking classified documents, charges were dropped because of illegal wiretapping. Lyndon Baines Johnson's administration efforts to mislead the American people were revealed with these papers, and as a result, the Nixon administration would create the Plumbers. This would be a secret group to try to stop leaks from further coming out of the federal government. Sending the troops home. Peace talks in Vietnam preceded in the 1972 presidential election did not amount to much. Eventually, an agreement was signed to end the war and restore peace in the land. The North did not keep its side of the agreements and left 150,000 soldiers in the South. On March 29, 1973, the last combat troops left South Vietnam and 600 prisoners of war were released. Within 2 years of American evacuation, South Vietnam would fall to Northern forces. The last soldier left Vietnam on March 29, 1973. The same day, 600 prisoners of war were released from the Hanoi Hilton. On April 30th, 1975, the day the last U.S. helicopter left the embassy in South Vietnam, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese communists. In total, 58,000 Americans lost their lives in the Vietnam War. The Nixon Doctrine and a Thawing Cold War. Henry Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State, worked closely with Nixon on foreign policy issues. Nixon's area of strength. Nixon was the first president since Eisenhower to have a Congress on the opposite party. Kissinger suggested the United States return to a foreign policy that used the CIA to pursue American interests abroad without pulling the United States into the war and military actions that involved troops. When Socialist Party leader of Chile, Salvador Allende, won the presidential election despite CIA funding of his non-communist opponents, the CIA encouraged Chilean military leaders to stage a coup. After Allende died, either murder or suicide, General Augusto Pinochet declared himself the head of state, and the United States initially supported him because he seemed to agree to support U.S. interests. Instead, he became a ruthless dictator and undermined U.S. interests and human rights in Chile. The promise made by John F. Kennedy in the beginning of the decade to send a man to the moon and bring him safely back to Earth came true. The Apollo 11's crew of Michael Collins, Neil Armstrong, and Buzz Aldrin lifted off from Cape Canaveral on July 16, 1969. Armstrong would be the first man to step foot on the lunar surface on July 20th by saying, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," and then would return. Other missions would follow. Apollo 13 almost ended in disaster, and the last of the Apollo missions would be the Apollo 17 in 1972. The Nixon Doctrine asserted the United States would support proxy warfare, but not use American troops to fight communism. Nixon realized in 1969 that the Cold War dichotomy was giving way to a multi-power system. So he took the opportunity to open China to American markets by recognizing the communist government there, even visiting the nation. With President Richard M. Nixon's visit to China in 1972, the United States formally recognized the communist government. So sorry, Taiwan. China welcomed American advances as the relations with their fellow communists in the USSR were deteriorating. Upon conclusion of the Sino-American agreements, the Soviets sought to soften relations with the Americans as well. Embracing the Soviet Union. Nixon pursued a policy of de-escalating tensions called détente between the United States and communist nations. In 1972, Nixon stunned the world by announcing he would meet with the new Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev. Nixon succeeded in negotiating the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, called SALT, limiting both nations' intercontinental ballistic missiles of ICBMs. Shuttle diplomacy. Nixon worked to show the U.S. recognition of Arab power in the Middle East and its own dependence on foreign oil through his and Secretary of State Kissinger's diplomacy during the Middle East crisis of the 1970s. Watergate, the election of 1972. The foreign policy accomplishments of Nixon made him virtually unbeatable in the 1972 presidential election. The Democrats nominated George McGovern to challenge him, who was actually advocating the legal use of marijuana, which was very radical for 1972. Attorney General John Mitchell, in a secret operation to spy and sabotage the Democratic primary campaigns by forging campaign correspondence, making false leaks to the press, and seizing confidential files from the Democratic offices. 5 burglars hired by the committee to re-elect the president were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee office in the Watergate apartment complex. The leader, James McCord, was also an official for the committee to re-elect the president. Creep. When Nixon actually first heard about his reaction was, well, who are the assholes who authorized this? This tells us that Nixon did not know anything about these dirty tricks. But due to his paranoia, he would not come clean because he lost to Kennedy by a very narrow margin, and he just beat Hubert Humphrey by a very narrow margin. And so the cover-up begins. McGovern was crushed, receiving only 17 electoral votes to Nixon's 520. The election was marred only by the odd break-in of the Watergate headquarters. Uncovering the cover-up. Woodward and Bernstein of the Washington Post began to write a series of articles on the break-in. Chief among the Post's anonymous sources was an individual whom Woodward and Bernstein had nicknamed Deep Throat. 30 years later, in 2005, he was revealed to be William Mark Felt, Sr., the former Deputy Director of the FBI. Felt was passed over to replace J. Edgar Hoover for the FBI when he died. Felt met secretly with Woodward, telling him of Howard Hunt's involvement with the Watergate break-in and that the White House staff regarded the stakes in Watergate extremely high. Felt warned Woodward that the FBI wanted to know where he and the other reporters were getting their information, as they were uncovering a wider web of crimes than first disclosed. President Nixon authorized the appointment of a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, to investigate Watergate. During the Senate Select Committee in May of 1973, a special committee chaired by Senator Sam Ervin, a North Carolina Democrat, called Nixon administrators to give testimony. Senator Howard Baker, Republican from Tennessee, would ask, what did the president know and when did he know it? John Dean said that Nixon was deeply involved in the cover-up and revealed the presence of a taping system in the Oval Office. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox now requested those tapes. Nixon would claim executive privilege and ordered Cox to be fired. This would be known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Downfall of a president. Although he had been elected again as vice president, Spiro T. Agnew did not succeed Nixon. He had been forced to resign when it came to light that he had accepted bribes as governor of Maryland. The 25th Amendment. Nixon now turned to nominate Gerald Ford, the minority leader of the Republican Party in the House, under the 25th Amendment. This allowed the president to nominate anyone he saw fit as vice president as long as there was a vacancy, and it was approved by both the House and the Senate. The 25th Amendment also has a clause in the case that the president becomes incapacitated or probably could not be able to serve, the vice president would then take over. Indictments. Mitchell, Haldeman, and Erickman were all indicted. Nixon would release transcripts of the tapes, but on July 24, 1974, the Supreme Court orders Nixon to hand over the tapes. Nixon did turn the tapes over, but there found to be an 18-minute gap that was erased. On July 27th, the House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment. On August 8th, Richard Nixon would become the first president of the United States to resign his office. The effects of Watergate. The troubling aspects of the Watergate scandal included the revelation that the White House had compiled an enemies list of dissenters, lies that were told by the Nixon administration regarding their involvement, and funds accepted by the from honest Americans are being used to finance illegal activities. Congress had passed a War Powers Act in 1973 in order to limit the president's authority to wage war. But it was generally the loss of faith. The Watergate crisis revealed Richard Nixon was driven by an overwhelming urge for power. Many members of the administration had broken the law. The American people had a major loss of faith in their government. Americans were brought up to trust their government, to tell them the truth. In the two major instances, first of the Pentagon Papers that revealed that getting into Vietnam was a total lie, and secondly, the Watergate break-in and cover-up led by a president of the United States. To this day, many Americans still do not trust what they're being told by the federal government. An unelected president. Now Ford was the president of the United States. 1 month after taking the oath of office, Ford pardoned Richard Nixon from any crimes or suspect crimes due to the Watergate break-in. Ford believed it was best to put the Watergate nightmare behind us. He was heavily criticized. His career would never recover. But 20 years later, Ford was awarded the Profiles in Courage by the Kennedy family. Ford would veto 39 bills while in office, more than Hoover, who had the full term to do so. Ford rejected pressure to cut taxes and spending, resulting in a plummeting economy and unemployment as high as 9%. He retained Kissinger as Secretary of State and met with Brezhnev in 1974 to negotiate SALT II. During the presidential election in 1976, Ford embattled California Governor Ronald Reagan for the Republican nomination in 1976. It was always believed that whoever is the sitting president in the Republican Party would have that office. Reagan argued, well, Ford was never elected to that office, he is appointed, so it didn't count. Ford would finally beat out Reagan. The Democrats nominated an outsider, Governor Jimmy Carter of Georgia. Carter would win the presidency with 297 electoral votes to 240 for Ford. Only 2 million votes separated the two candidates. And so this concludes our study of the Nixon White House and the time period of his administration.